Tonight we're heading back to the shadowy corridors and drafty bedchambers of medieval castles, where romance was rare, privacy was laughable, and let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not because of a joust or a plague rat, although both are highly likely, but because you might die of second-hand embarrassment from just how awkward and earthy sex really was back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not saying there's a chastity belt of guilt clamped around this ask, but you know, medieval theme and all. Also, drop your city and what time you're watching this in the comments. Are you dozing off at midnight in Manchester, or catching this at sunrise in Manila? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, first things first, chastity belts. They've become the punchline of every Renaissance fair and cartoon about horny knights and nervous noblewomen. But here's the real kicker. They probably weren't real, at least not in the way you've been led to believe. Those iron underpants with terrifying locks and ventilation holes? Most were made centuries after the medieval period, likely as gag gifts, moral warnings, or museum hoaxes. In fact, many supposed authentic chastity belts in European museums have been quietly relabeled or removed entirely after closer examination revealed 19th century forgery techniques. Turns out, medieval folks were weird, but not that weird. So if there weren't rows of locked-up ladies clanking around castles, what was going on behind those stone walls? Well, everything. And almost none of it was subtle. Imagine this. You're in a smoky, echoing great hall with torchlight bouncing off rough stone. Dogs are fighting over scraps under the table. You've just eaten something called blancmange made with fish, rice and almonds, and now it's bedtime. But here's the twist. Your bedroom is actually a curtained-off alcove next to 5 other people, including your brother, your wife, and possibly a servant named Giles who's already snoring. Privacy, as we think of it today, was basically non-existent in most castles. The architecture itself didn't allow for it. Bedrooms were communal, curtains were a luxury, and people slept wherever was warm. Sometimes that meant cramming into one bed for body heat. And if the lord and lady of the castle did get a private chamber, guess what? It wasn't that private. Servants came and went constantly, tending fires, laying out clothes, even listening in on conversations to report back to someone else. That quiet, moonlit moment of medieval passion. Yeah, it came with background noise and about 4 witnesses. Despite all this, sex was everywhere. Not always in the romantic or even consensual sense, but as a constant part of life. You couldn't escape it, not with chamber pots being emptied out windows or birthing happening just 1 floor down. Castle life was, in a word, bodily. It smelled, it echoed, it involved squeaky floorboards and creaky joints. And yet, amid all that, people still found ways to flirt, seduce, and, occasionally, fall in love. And when they did, it was rarely about just the 2 of them. Marriages were mostly strategic, especially among nobility. Your job as a young noblewoman wasn't to find the love of your life. It was to bring a dowry, breed heirs, and hopefully not die in childbirth. For noblemen, the arrangement came with political advantages, land transfers, and sometimes the added bonus of marrying someone young enough to have never formed her own opinions. The wedding night? That was a whole thing. Sometimes the lord and lady's first coupling was witnessed by family members to ensure consummation. And let me tell you, the phrase awkward third wheel doesn't even begin to cover it. But here's a quirky little twist. Despite the prim and pious image the church tried to paint, people were still, well, people. They fooled around. They flirted. They read some very NSFW manuscripts hidden in the margins of illuminated texts. That's right. While monks were copying the Bible by candlelight, some couldn't resist doodling explicit scenes in the corners. You'd turn a page to find a tiny nun spanking a knight or a man sprouting, inappropriate foliage. Call it medieval meme culture. Even the church, that looming presence of guilt and moral regulation, couldn't fully control the pulse of human desire. Yes, they tried, by labeling pretty much every fun sexual act as a sin, by demanding confession after even marital sex, and by warning that too much passion could summon demons. Yes, actual demons, with horns and everything. But behind closed doors, or more often slightly ajar wooden ones, life continued. Love letters were slipped beneath doors, glances lingered across feasting tables, And sometimes, when the fire crackled low and everyone else was asleep, something more might happen, even if the hay poked in all the wrong places. There's also the cold truth that power was a major factor in medieval sexuality. Lords had control over servants, knights over peasant women, and marriages could be arranged at terrifyingly young ages. It wasn't a world of consent as we understand it today. But it was also a world full of contradictions. Bawdy songs at festivals, public dances that were practically grinding, and carnivals where everything goes was almost the rule. So, as you sit there beneath your clean duvet, possibly within reach of 2 pillows and a phone that no one else has access to, remember this. Medieval castle life was loud, crowded, smelly, and incredibly human. The myths, chastity belts, noble passion, damsels sighing into silk sheets, those were mostly written later by people who either wanted to romanticize the past or laugh at it. The truth, far weirder, far messier, and somehow more real. Next up, we're going to peek behind some of those not-so-private chamber doors and see how a castle's architecture shaped the way people got busy, or, more often, didn't. So, let's slide deeper into the castle now. Not the tower or the banquet hall, but those inner rooms where the real human drama unfolded. You'd think sex in a medieval castle happened behind thick wooden doors with big iron locks and maybe a tapestry or two flapping gently in the breeze. Nope. What you're imagining is Victorian. A medieval castle is more like a giant stone echo chamber, where secrets are hard to keep, and walls aren't exactly known for their soundproofing. Picture this. You step into the Lord and Lady's chamber. It's the biggest sleeping space in the castle, maybe even blessed with a fireplace that mostly keeps the chill off. There's a huge 4-poster bed in the centre, the mattress stuffed with straw and feathers, creaking under the weight of thick linen sheets and a few fleas. If the Lord is wealthy, the bed might have curtains, luxurious velvet or wool that can be drawn for a semblance of privacy. But even then, there are at least 2 servants sleeping in the same room, one by the fire, one on a pallet near the door. And guess what? They're listening. Servants were everywhere. You couldn't dress, undress, or roll over in bed without someone being nearby. That whole "do not disturb" vibe didn't exist. In fact, the presence of witnesses during intimate moments wasn't just tolerated, it was expected in many noble marriages. A nobleman might even call in a few trusted onlookers to confirm he and his bride had done the deed, especially if land, titles, or money were on the line. A failed consummation, that could lead to annulment, scandal, and potentially a war between families. Nothing kills the mood like your great-uncle watching from a wooden stool holding a candle. The architecture of castles didn't help. Thick stone walls meant the rooms were always cold, and any warmth had to be generated by bodies, or fire. Fireplaces were inefficient, drafty windows let in the wind, and insulation was not a thing. Because of this, people slept in clusters. Servants huddled in corners, kids bunked with parents. In winter, it wasn't uncommon to sleep fully dressed. Stockings, caps, even gloves, under heavy woolen blankets. Want to sneak off for a bit of romance? Good luck finding a place where the floor doesn't squeak or someone isn't already asleep in it. Now, castles were designed for defence, not comfort. That meant narrow hallways, high ceilings, echoing stairwells, and very little in the way of intimate corners. Any sounds, especially the squeaky rhythmic ones, tended to travel. You couldn't whisper without it bouncing down the corridor, and if someone was up to something after dark, well, by breakfast, the entire household probably knew. Gossip moved faster than plague fleas. Still, humans are nothing if not adaptable. Despite the lack of privacy, people found ways to carve out moments for themselves. Sometimes it was in the garderobe, the medieval toilet, which yes, doubled as a secret meeting spot. Other times, a couple might sneak up to the battlements or into the kitchen after hours. Even the chapel, solemn as it was, wasn't off limits for a stolen kiss. Just don't get caught. You didn't want to explain to a priest why there were muddy footprints leading to the altar. Here's a fun fact. Many medieval beds were actually built to accommodate more than just 2 people. Family beds could be wide enough to fit several siblings, a visiting cousin, and even a dog or 2. These weren't romantic spaces, they were practical heat-sharing machines. So if you were lucky enough to have a bed to yourself, or just you and your chosen partner, it was probably because you were filthy rich or someone had died recently. There was also a kind of low-level surveillance going on in most castles. Noble households were political environments where alliances were everything, and a slip in sexual decorum could mean disaster. Ladies-in-waiting kept an eye on noblewomen, reporting any flirtation or suspicious behaviour. Stewards and butlers often knew who was sneaking into whose chamber at night, and sometimes they even encouraged it. If a nobleman needed an heir, the pressure to produce one could turn a cold marriage into a carefully managed production. But what about the commoners, you ask? The maids, squires, and lower-ranking knights. Their experiences were no more private. If anything, they were more exposed. Servants often slept in large groups on haymats in side halls or storage rooms. Romances bloomed under blankets or behind barrels in the cellar. It was noisy, cramped, and incredibly unglamorous. But love, or at least lust, still found a way. And here's your quirky historical twist. In some castles, there were actually designated courting spaces, like small alcoves off the main hall where couples could talk semi-privately. These weren't love nests. They were more like awkward interview booths, but they allowed for semi-sanctioned flirtation. Picture a shy nobleman trying to impress a lady with tales of his falconry skills, while her chaperone lurks just a few feet away, pretending to be very interested in a tapestry. Now, historians do debate one juicy topic. Were secret tunnels in castles actually used for romantic trysts? While some castles had hidden staircases and passageways, designed more for escape during sieges than sneaking off with the cook's daughter, it's tempting to imagine these dim, narrow corridors hosting late-night rendezvous. Some say yes, some say it's pure fantasy. One French castle even has a legend about a knight who built an entire hidden corridor so he could visit a lady without crossing the main courtyard, but no solid proof, just enough smoke to suggest a little fire. Ultimately, medieval castle life was a lesson in adaptation. You learned to make your moves quietly, to work within the rhythm of the household, and to rely on quick glances and stolen moments instead of grand gestures. There was no romantic soundtrack, no scented candles, no locking the door behind you, just stone, straw, and a whole lot of improvisation. Next time, we're diving into the deeply unromantic world of medieval marriage arrangements, and trust me, nothing screams passion like your dowry being measured in goats and linen. You're back in the castle, and this time, the fire's low, the draft is extra moody, and you're about to witness something even more chilling than a haunted suit of armour, a marriage negotiation. Yep, forget star-crossed lovers. In the medieval world, the real magic words were land transfer, dowry, and political alliance. Love? That came somewhere between securing an heir and making sure your livestock didn't die of foot rot. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't really about two hearts fluttering toward each other. It was a business deal, plain and simple. Families arranged unions for power, property, and preservation of noble bloodlines. The couple getting married, they usually had about as much say as the family's prized cow. If you were the daughter of a nobleman, your wedding might be negotiated when you were still learning to walk. And once the ink was dry on the parchment, that was that. You were spoken for. Let's say you're a young noblewoman, we'll call you Isolde, and your father's got a moderately impressive castle, some grain-producing land and a couple of peacocks. His eyes are on a nearby lord whose family owns better farmland but fewer military allies. Perfect match, right? So what if the lord's son, your future husband, is 12 years older than you and has a suspicious mole shaped like the Holy Roman Empire? You'll meet him once, maybe twice before the wedding. Hope you like beats and silence. Now, if you're a nobleman, your job is to get married early, sire sons fast, and preferably not die in a tournament. You're looking for a wife with good connections and a hefty dowry. Land, money, clothes, or sometimes even livestock. Yes, goats. Goats could clinch a marriage deal. If the dowry was rich enough, the bride didn't even have to be attractive, or, conscious of the whole situation. And here's the thing. There were actual brokers for these matches. Professional matchmakers. Think medieval Tinder, except it's your aunt. A quill, and no swipe left option. These brokers were trusted advisors, often clergy or nobles themselves, who knew everyone's business and weren't above a little exaggeration. Oh yes, Lord Dunrick's daughter is very fertile. Translation. She's had rashes, but nothing contagious. The marriage contract was a serious legal document, signed by both families, often sealed in front of witnesses and sometimes the church. It laid out everything from property rights to the handling of future disputes. In fact, it was so binding that even the Pope couldn't always annul it. Unless, of course, a lot of money was involved. There were escape clauses, but they were rare. If either party turned out to be too closely related, yes, this happened a lot, the marriage could be called off. But even then, only after it caused massive social awkwardness and possibly war. And the wedding, not what you think. Lavish, yes. Full of joy, debatable. The ceremony was as much about the families uniting as the couple. You'd be married in the church, possibly in Latin, with a priest rattling off blessings while a bored noble tried to stay awake in the front pew. Then came the bedding. Yep, the guests would escort the couple to their room, often with crude jokes, drinks and songs, and sometimes they'd even stick around long enough to make sure the new couple got down to business. Nothing like having your aunt hand you a goblet while suggesting ways to encourage fertility. You might think that once married, the couple had at least a shot at building affection. Sometimes they did. There are records of noble couples who grew fond of each other, even affectionate. But more often, it was a cold alliance. The husband had mistresses. The wife managed the estate. They met in the night to produce children, then went back to their separate interests. And if one of them died, the surviving spouse remarried almost immediately, not out of heartbreak, but necessity. And it wasn't just the nobles. Peasants had their own marriage customs, and while love played a slightly larger role, the economics was still front and centre. A peasant father wanted his daughter to marry a man who could keep her fed, not one who made her giggle. The church eventually started regulating peasant marriages too, declaring that a couple could wed with mutual consent, even without parental approval. This didn't sit well with parents, who wanted some say in where their daughters ended up, preferably not in the next village with that creepy shepherd who talks to his goats. There's a surprisingly modern debate among scholars about how much freedom women really had in choosing spouses. Some believe noble women were entirely at the mercy of their fathers. Others argue that some savvy daughters, especially widows or heiresses, used influence and clever alliances to sway decisions. Evidence exists of women writing letters pleading for or against a marriage match. In one case, a woman flat out refused to marry the man chosen for her, escaped the estate, and married someone else. The scandal was massive. The outcome? She kept the husband and gained a reputation for being spirited, code for terrifyingly independent. Oh, and let's talk about age. Brace yourself. Medieval brides were often between 12 and 16 years, old when they married. Grooms could be anywhere from teenagers to old men in need of heirs before they died. The church technically said you could marry at age 7, though you couldn't consummate until puberty. Let that sink in. The logic was, start young, secure the alliance, and figure out the rest later. Love was for troubadours and foolish poets. Marriage was for survival. One of the strangest courtship traditions, trial marriages. In parts of medieval Europe, couples would live together for a year before deciding to tie the knot officially. The church hated this, obviously, but it happened. In fact, some considered a mutual promise followed by sex to be a valid marriage, no priest required. This grey area led to messy legal disputes and sudden claims of, but we were already married last spring behind the barn. So yeah, beneath the fluttering banners and wedding feasts, medieval marriage was more practical than passionate, more about power than partnership. And while some couples managed to forge connection or even genuine affection, the system wasn't built for romance. It was built for lineage, leverage, and land grabs. Up next, we're walking into the confessional, because the church had opinions about what you did in the dark, and let's just say they were very detailed and extremely judgmental. Alright, so now you're married, probably too young, to someone you've barely spoken to, in a deal that was negotiated like a trade agreement, and now it's time to get on with the business of marital duties. But not so fast. Before you so much as think about getting frisky in that drafty four-poster bed, you'd better consider one important party who was definitely not invited to the honeymoon: the church. Yes, the Catholic Church was the ultimate third wheel in every medieval bedroom. From the 5th century all the way through the end of the Middle Ages, it held an iron grip on what was morally acceptable in the world of sex, and spoiler alert, very little of it was. Forget experimentation, spontaneity, or even enthusiasm. According to church doctrine, sex had one purpose: procreation. Everything else was a slippery slope to damnation, probably with fire, demons, and eternal regret. Let's say it's your wedding night. You lie down next to your new spouse, nerves jangling, maybe a little wine in your system. You pull back the blanket and hold up. Have you confessed your sins lately? because according to many priests, entering the act with a lustful heart, or with too much enjoyment, could jeopardize your soul. That's right, even married sex was suspect if it wasn't sufficiently solemn and purpose-driven. Imagine trying to be intimate while picturing St. Augustine judging you from the corner. The church published long lists, very long lists, of what was considered sinful in the bedroom. These weren't vague, be good statements. We're talking detailed, step-by-step prohibitions. Certain positions were frowned upon, too much noise, questionable, daytime sex, risky, sex during Lent, Advent, or on Sundays, flat outnumber pregnancy, menstruation, or illness. Better hold off. Essentially, if the calendar didn't say sex allowed, you were supposed to abstain. Some scholars estimate there were fewer than 100 permissible days in the year, out of 365. So if you were really following the rules, you were basically a monk with a ring on. Now, that didn't mean people actually followed all this to the letter. There's a vast gulf between doctrine and practice. But the fear was real. A lot of medieval Christians carried guilt about sex, even within marriage. Confession became the place where people unloaded their sins of the flesh. Priests often grilled penitents on the specifics. How often, in what way, with what intentions. It got uncomfortably personal. Picture whispering your sexual routine to a celibate man with a notebook. Romantic, huh? And it gets weirder. Some theologians believed that demons could be summoned during particularly lustful acts, especially if they involved unnatural behaviour. These demons, called incubi and succubi, were said to prey on humans in their sleep, seducing them and stealing their energy, or worse, their souls. So if you had a particularly vivid dream one night, you might wake up wondering if you'd been visited by a sex demon. The line between sin and supernatural was paper thin, but not everyone was all fire and brimstone. There were fringe thinkers, yes, even among clergy, who wrote surprisingly progressive treatises on sex. Some even acknowledged pleasure as a gift from God when enjoyed within marriage, and in rare cases married couples with strong emotional bonds were celebrated. Still, these were the exceptions. The general tone was, sex is necessary but deeply suspicious. Like using a medieval chamber pot, you do it because you must, not because you're thrilled about it. A popular medieval guide for confessors, the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, went deep into these issues. Aquinas was the guy who argued that even laughter during sex was problematic because it showed too much delight. Fun fact, Aquinas also had a theory that women were biologically inferior because they were the result of weak sperm. So yeah, not exactly a sex-positive icon. But beyond the church's official stance, there were local customs and traditions that softened the edges. In some rural areas, fertility festivals still took place, with ancient pagan rituals thinly disguised as Christian celebrations. May Day, for example, often involved young people disappearing into the woods together, returning looking, well, rather pleased with themselves. The church tried to crack down on these events, but culture has a way of surviving repression. What's also fascinating is that people developed coded language to talk about sex. Courtly poetry, ballads, and even religious texts used metaphor and symbolism to describe desire. A knight's sword became a pretty obvious symbol. A lady's garden didn't need much translation. This was how people expressed sexuality without triggering the wrath of the local priest, or at least not openly. If you knew how to read between the lines, medieval literature was often sizzling. Of course, all this spiritual policing didn't apply equally. Men had more wiggle room, especially powerful men. Kings and lords had mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and still received communion on Sundays. For women, though, the standard was harsh. A married woman who cheated could be divorced, punished, even executed in extreme cases. A man, he might get a slap on the wrist or a stern talking to from his confessor. Sound fair? Of course not. Welcome to medieval morality. There's still scholarly debate about how deeply church teachings shaped people's actual behaviour. Some historians argue that rural folks mostly ignored the fire and brimstone messaging, living according to older, earthier traditions. Others say the church's influence was massive, permeating everything from family planning to bedroom design, those separate twin beds, a nod to moral purity. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. People internalised the rules they feared most, and bent the ones they thought they could get away with. And let's not forget, The clergy itself wasn't exactly celibate in practice. Plenty of monks and priests had housekeepers who mysteriously became pregnant. Entire towns knew about Father Bertrand's mistress, but looked the other way until the bishop showed up. The church tried to reform this over and over again, but libido doesn't read policy manuals. So now imagine you're lying in that cold, candle-lit bedroom, trying to remember if it's a sin to enjoy your spouse's touch. You're doing mental math on the liturgical calendar, the moon phase, and whether this counts as lustful intent. Meanwhile, your partner just wants to pull the covers up and pretend the priest isn't lurking in the back of your head. Welcome to the reality of medieval intimacy under divine surveillance. Next time, we'll flip through some of the most scandalous how-to guides of the